The day Margaret Hargrove called me just a temp. I was standing at the back of her conference room, holding a tray of coffee cups I hadn't been asked to set down yet. She was addressing her senior staff, 8 people in tailored suits arranged around a table that cost more than my truck. A government auditor named Bliss had called the firm that morning, and no one in the room knew why. Margaret was calm about it, the way a person is calm when they believe they have nothing to hide. She said the auditor would arrive at 2 o'clock, the firm's records were clean, and that she expected every department head present. Then she looked at me, at the tray, at my rolled sleeves and the laminated temp badge on my collar. And she said evenly and without malice, "Please clear the table before 2, and then you can take the afternoon." She wasn't being cruel. I want to be clear about that. She saw what the badge said, and she acted accordingly. That is what I told Pete that evening, sitting at our kitchen table with the radio on low. My son is 14, quiet, fair-minded the way his mother was. He heard the story, thought it over, and said, "Did you tell her?" I said no. He nodded once, like that was the answer he expected. I had taken the temp assignment at Hargrove and Associates 6 weeks earlier. Pete's school moved to a district 30 miles outside the city, and I followed him, the way you do. I needed work while I sorted out the permanent picture. The placement agency sent me to Hargrove because the firm needed someone to organize 40 years of physical files in their records basement. Classified adjacents, archived contracts, government correspondence going back to the 1980s. I told the agency I had experience with sensitive records. That was accurate. What I did not tell the agency, or Margaret Hargrove, or anyone at the firm, was that I had spent 30 years as a covert analyst and contract officer for a government intelligence unit whose name I am not at liberty to use here. I left the work 11 years ago, quietly, when my wife Carol got her diagnosis and Pete was 3 years old. I walked away without ceremony. That is the nature of the work. You leave, and the world closes over the space you occupied, and that is exactly how this is supposed to go. I spent 8 of those 11 years caring for Carol, and then 3 years learning how to be a father who was also all of it. The cook and the coach. The one who sat in the back of the school play with a program folded in his hand. Pete doesn't know what I used to do. He knows I worked for the government. He knows I left. He knows his father shows up. The records basement at Hargrove was not disorganized so much as it was chronologically dishonest. Contracts misfiled by a decade. Correspondence folders split across 4 different cabinets with no cross-reference. I spent 2 weeks simply making a map of what was there. The 4th week, I understood something that the firm's current staff almost certainly did not. 3 of Hargrove and Associates' foundational federal contracts, the ones that gave the firm its security clearances and its standing with the Department of Defense, had been brokered in the late 1990s through a classified intermediary arrangement. The intermediary's identity was redacted in the firm's own copies, but I knew who that intermediary was, because I had been the one who signed the originating paperwork on the government side. I had sat across a table from Margaret's father, Douglas Hargrove, in a nondescript conference room in 1997, and I had told him that if he built his firm the right way, the right ethics and the right protocols, I would see to it that 3 foundational defense contracts came to him. He did. I did. And then I disappeared back into work that had no name. Douglas Hargrove died in 2014. Margaret took over the firm. She had no reason to know any of this. The records that would tell her were locked in a redacted file in a government archive, accessible only to credentialed personnel. Frank Bliss was credentialed personnel. He arrived at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday in a gray suit with a government ID on a lanyard. And when Margaret's assistant brought him to the conference room, he stopped in the corridor outside the records room, threw the glass at me, working at the sorting table, and said, "That's Ray Caulfield." Margaret's assistant relayed this to Margaret, came down herself. I heard her heels on the concrete floor before she appeared in the doorway. She looked at me, then at Bliss, then at me again. Bliss said, "Mr. Caulfield, I apologize for the informality of this. We have a pending re-verification on the 3 founding contracts routine, decennial review. The originating officer's signature is required for continuity of clearance." "I had no idea you were here," Margaret said. "Originating officer. I set down the folder I was holding. I said, "Mrs. Hargrove, I think we should sit down." We sat in the same conference room where she had dismissed me that morning. Bliss, a thin folder on the table. The kind of folder that looks unremarkable and is not. He slid it across to Margaret. She opened it. I watched her read. She is not a woman who shows much on her face, but she went still in a way that is different from composure. Eyes moved down the first page, and then she turned to the second, and her hand came to rest flat on the table without her seeming to notice T moved it. The file contained a condensed record of my service, 30 years of work, most of it still classified in its specifics, but the broad architecture visible. The contracts were there. The 3 foundational agreements her father had signed, with my name on the originating government authorization, the dates, the terms, the flag at the top of the page that said, in plain government language, that the continued validity of those contracts required my signature on the decennial re-verification because I was the originating officer of record, and I had never been replaced, because the unit had simply ceased to exist after a reorganization in 2009, and the paperwork had never been transferred. Grove and Associates had been operating on contracts that technically only I could reauthorize. Margaret looked up. I held her gaze and waited. She said, "You've been in my records room for 6 weeks. Yes, you knew this was here. I found it in the 3rd week. I was going to request a meeting." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the parking lot was flat and bright in the afternoon sun. Courier van pulled in and pulled out again. She said, "My father never told me he could. It was a condition of the arrangement. He honored it for 17 years. Another silence. Then she said, "I called you just a temp this morning. You called me what my badge said." She looked at the file again, at the flag page, at the years. Then she said, "What do you need from us, Mr. Caulfield?" I told her I didn't need anything. I told her the re-verification was a formality. I would sign it, Bliss would process it, and her firm's standing would be confirmed for another 10 years. I told her I was not there to leverage anything or to claim anything. I was there because my son started in a snooze school 6 weeks ago, and I needed a steady reason to leave the house in the mornings until I figured out the next thing. She listened to all of that. Then she said, "I'd like to offer you a permanent position, whatever the title and compensation look like to you." I told her I appreciated that. I told her I had one condition. She said, "Name it." I said, "The records room. Give it a proper archivist and a proper system. What's in those files is the institutional memory of everything your father built. It deserves better than cardboard boxes and misfiled decades." She said she would have a proposal on my desk. "Mites," she said, "not the sorting table. By Friday." I signed the re-verification form. Bliss countersigned. The whole thing took 11 minutes. Walking to my truck that afternoon, I called Pete. He was at soccer practice, so I left a message. I told him I might have a real job after all. I told him the commute was reasonable. I told him I'd pick up something for dinner. He called back 20 minutes later, still breathing hard from the field. He said, "Did she figure out who you were?" I said, "Eventually." He thought about that. Then he said, "Was she decent about it?" I said she was. He said, "Good, what are we having?" I told him I was thinking barbecue. He said that worked for him, and the line went quiet for a second. That particular quiet you get with a 14-year-old when he doesn't want to hang up but doesn't have more words ready, and then he said, "Thanks for staying, Dad." He meant the job. He might have meant more than that. With Pete, you never have to ask. I said, "That's what I do," and I meant it.